The Oval Office meeting between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Donald Trump was supposed to reaffirm US support for Ukraine. Instead, it exploded into a shouting match. Zelensky left empty-handed, no peace deal, no guarantees. Hours later, Trump pulled the plug on US military aid, leaving Ukraine exposed and scrambling. The fallout? A massive win for Vladimir Putin. In one move, Trump trashed 3 years of US support, undermined NATO, and pushed Ukraine toward a deal on Russia's terms. But here's the real kicker: this wasn't just incompetence, it was something worse. Because behind the chaos lies a ruthless plan, one that benefits Trump, Putin, and a handful of billionaires at Ukraine's expense. Let's break down what really happened and why it's more dangerous than anyone realized. Many experts believe that Trump possibly supports Putin's expansionist policies and shares his resentment of the decades-long alliance that is NATO, the cornerstone of international security relations throughout Europe. In truth, Trump's disagreements with NATO began long before the current war in Ukraine. Even during his first term as POTUS, he had been vocal about believing that the rest of NATO wasn't pulling its weight when it came to European defense funding, providing support in international cooperative operations, and maintaining a future-ready, independent defense force on the European continent. Most of Trump's claims would end up getting either debunked or actually improved upon in recent years. And yet the improvements were seemingly not enough to appease him coming into his second term in office. The main issue, defense contributions, wasn't solved per se, but most NATO members did start contributing more than the recommended 2% of their GDP. Among the most vital members that have made significant changes is Germany, which had a record low NATO contribution of only 1.1% of their GDP in 2014, but increased that contribution to 2.12% in 2024. Furthermore, at the beginning of March, the leading political parties in Germany, which would likely be forming a coalition, proposed a military infrastructure overhaul worth around $536 billion, roughly 7 times the country's estimated national defense budget for 2024. Another big change came from Poland, which had its NATO defense budget contribution reach over 4.1% of its GDP, outpacing even the US in relative military spending. This went in line with rapid acquisitions of thousands of tanks, armored vehicles, artillery launchers, and more than 150 new aircraft, as well as a plan to double its conscription numbers to get a standing army of 300,000 soldiers, which would make it rank among the top 25 militaries by active troop size. Despite that, Trump proudly proclaimed that he was rethinking the Mutual Defense Pact to prioritize the countries that contribute the most to defense, despite 23 out of 32 members reaching the recommended budget. He also went as far as to state that he doubted NATO would come to the US's aid if it was attacked. But recent history showed that he was already wrong. When the US invoked the famous Article 5 after the 9/11 attacks, European military sent their troops to the Middle East and into the war on terror to support the US that would end up costing the lives of thousands of Allied troops, 900,000 casualties, and over $8 trillion. The friction with NATO follows the seeming renewal of the Trump-Putin friendship. In actuality, allegations over the two world leaders' connections started even before Trump's first presidency. During the election of 2016, Trump announced that he doubted Russia was responsible for hacking the Democratic Party and his then-rival Hillary Clinton. The issue became a contributing factor for many voters who ended up siding with Trump. Then in 2018, Trump changed the tune and openly admitted that his own intelligence services all but confirmed that Russia alone was responsible for the attacks. Additional investigations suggested that Russia had likely not stopped there, but continued to perform disinformation campaigns in the US to boost Trump's approval in the years since. NBC News reported that a similar disinformation campaign is believed to have taken place during the 2024 presidential election. It claimed that Russia used fake accounts and bots to post doctored or manufactured content designed to damage Biden's reputation because of the technological advancements made in the 8 years between 2016, including deepfake and AI-generated content that was eerily realistic and difficult for some to discern. US experts feared the possible extent of the damage. The Russian technological warfare machine also targeted the Biden administration in 2022, immediately following the start of the invasion of Ukraine. The goal at the time was to sow division among the general public and Congress, which would ultimately lower the possible support Ukraine would receive from the biggest economy in the world. Coupled with the fact that the rest of NATO was still scrambling to shore up their own economies and militaries at the start of the invasion, Putin was able to cast serious doubts on whether Europe would be able to successfully defend Ukraine. This was followed by repeated threats from Russia of using its vast nuclear arsenal against Ukraine or possibly other countries to reduce the level and extent of donations NATO was providing. The plan worked, at least for a bit, as nations delayed donations of vital equipment. That delay allowed Russia to slowly advance into the Donbass region despite catastrophic, strategic, tactical, and logistical failures that saw their siege of Kyiv turned back just months after the invasion. Throughout all of this, Trump had seemingly kept in touch with Putin, starting with a vital phone call that the two men reportedly had in 2022, shortly after the invasion. Since then, Trump's main rhetoric has been that the war was a pointless waste of lives and that he had a plan to end it in 24 hours should he come back to the White House. And when he did win, it appeared he was laying plans for that end to be firmly in Russia's favor. Trump prioritized the possible gains the US and Russia could extract from the effort while putting Ukraine in severe debt and destroying the very integrity of the NATO pact. The main focus of the plan lies in the mineral deal that has been circulating in the debates and meetings. Ukraine lies on a geological gold mine of rare earth metals and precious minerals vital to contemporary and future-oriented industries. These include Ukraine possessing the world's 5th largest titanium deposit and 7% of all reserves, the 8th largest manganese deposit, the 10th largest iron deposit, the 10th largest uranium deposit, vital graphite and lithium deposits. Overall, Ukraine is estimated to have 5% of the global rare earth mineral and metal reserves. By comparison, the US has over 12 times the land area and only 1 to 2% of mineral deposits. All of these metals are absolutely crucial in both commercial and military applications. Titanium is a lightweight yet durable metal that's used in missiles, aircraft, military hardware, and satellites. Lithium is key to creating more durable batteries to replace the need for fossil fuels and has been necessary for products like computers, electric vehicles, smartphones, and anything else that uses a rechargeable battery, which has also started seeing military use. Ukraine's graphite deposit is estimated to be a fifth of the world's total reserve. This pliable and soft substance is recognizable in pencils, but it's also used as a lubricant in various manufacturing industries. But with all these deposits, Ukraine has only tapped into a fraction of its extracting, refining, and manufacturing potential. This stems from the country's history of corruption, exploitation, and subservience to the Soviet Union, under which the deposits were largely disregarded in favor of the more vital lumber, coal, or other more common metals. Pretty much every country interested in Ukraine today knows just how vital these mineral deposits are to modern industries. If Ukraine were to properly take advantage of them, it would make the country an industrial powerhouse. However, due to the country's relatively low manpower, slower technological adaptation compared to the West, and complex geopolitical ties, today's Ukraine has no chance or opportunity to tap into these plentiful resources. But the US, NATO, Russia, and China do, and that's why Putin is eager to exploit it first. Trump claimed that the US has spent over $300 billion in support of Ukraine, and Trump stated that he expects Ukraine to pay that money back. But that's highly unlikely, since it would put Ukraine in perpetual debt as the country needs hundreds of billions of dollars in future support just to recover its economy and industry first. So Trump's repayment plan is simple. Let the US mine the precious metals at a significant discount. The most recent iteration of the mineral plan, and one that Zelensky was even willing to consider, included Ukraine selling the minerals at half of their estimated value to the US, which accounted for roughly $500 billion, much more than the US actually invested into the country over the last 3 years. Mind you, the $300 billion figure peddled by Trump during meetings is a severe exaggeration. The Kiel Institute for the World Economy estimated that the US allocated roughly $114 billion in government support over the course of 2022, 23, and 24. Another $60 billion was estimated to have been spent inside the US to manufacture and procure weapons and ammunition that were then sent to Ukraine. Thus, a generous estimate would be that the US has spent roughly $200 billion to help Ukraine, undercutting Trump's claims by $100 billion. And even that number may not reflect what actually reached Ukraine. According to a recent study published by the Kyiv Post, of the $65.9 billion in military aid the US claimed to have sent, only $18.3 billion has materialized. But the mineral deal that Zelensky and Trump tried and failed to sign has two vastly different interpretations depending on which of the world leaders you talk to. Trump wants a purely economic deal where the US can send its mining and commercial manpower and equipment to extract the resources and ship them back to the US. Zelensky wants assurance that the US would send peacekeeping forces, i.e. the military, to protect its investment in Ukraine and keep Russia from renewing the war. In both interpretations, the mineral deal follows a ceasefire or even a full peace agreement. But Trump's deal is actually much more egregious than just abusing Ukraine's resources. According to him, Putin has a legitimate claim to parts of the Donbass and Crimea that Russia occupied or annexed over the past decade of conflict. His proposal was for Ukraine to accept ceding the occupied territory to Russia while also prohibiting Ukraine from entering NATO. There are multiple implications that come from this interpretation. First, the Russian invasion started after Ukraine reduced its dependence on Russia and internal corruption and began solidifying its ties to the West, including considering joining the EU and NATO. According to Putin and Trump, Ukrainians are just confused Russians and would do better being reunited with the motherland, even if by force. When the war actually started in 2022, Ukraine immediately submitted an application for NATO membership. While an application can't be considered for a country that's currently in open conflict and territorial dispute, it made it clear that Ukraine wants the umbrella of NATO's Article 5 protection as one of the main outcomes of the war, regardless of the geopolitical concessions it has to make. Secondly, by allowing Russia to retain the territory it occupied, Ukraine would lose roughly 20% of its land. Some of that land includes the deposits of the aforementioned precious metals. Others are vital arable land for the country's booming agricultural sector, as Ukraine is the world's 7th largest grain exporter. In either case, surrendering territory was never on the books for Ukraine as part of a peace deal, as it would clearly imply a Russian victory and overturn decades of Ukraine's territorial integrity. Worse yet, it would go directly against the agreement ratified in 1994, where Ukraine was promised full control over its territory and assurance of non-aggression from Russia in return for ceasing ownership of nuclear weapons it retained as part of the collapsed Soviet Union. Thirdly, the deal clearly undervalues the potential of the mineral reserves that Ukraine has while providing zero reassurance that the war will actually end. In Trump's version of the deal, Russia gets a part of eastern Ukraine. The US sends its mining companies to town, extracting precious metals from the country's east and south, and Ukraine gets what is essentially an IOU piece of paper, suggesting that Russia may or may not repeat the invasion in the future. Trump's current proposal is hardly better than a ceasefire in which NATO doesn't actually commit any more resources to Ukraine than it already has. The country's economy and industry will be propped up by the US mining investments, but there's no security reassurance that it would keep its independence. In effect, Ukraine would be politically and economically fractured between Russia and the US, while China indirectly picks up the pieces, which we'll discuss a bit later. The rest of NATO, primarily Western Europe, doesn't agree with Trump's plans, which is ostensibly what's causing the current fracturing in inter-NATO relations. For what seems like a once-in-a-century event, the entire British Parliament was unanimous in its support for Ukraine. The British Prime Minister suggested that the UK, France, and other European countries send their peacekeeping forces to Ukraine, instead of the US, in a potential ceasefire or peace deal. This will provide Ukraine with some security assurance, as the combined European NATO is still leagues ahead of Russia's current military capabilities, sans the nuclear arsenal. Some European analysts and politicians went so far as to compare Trump's deal with Nazi appeasement at the onset of World War II. Sir Ben Wallace, former Defense Secretary for the UK, likened the current proposals and conversations to Chamberlain's famous Peace in Our Time talk after the disastrous 1938 Munich conference that saw Germany effectively occupy Czechoslovakia and start World War II a year later. The same concept could be applied to the current ceasefire proposals that Trump is suggesting to Ukraine. With no security reassurance from the US or NATO, as Trump's proposal would likely attempt to force NATO's hand and prevent increased security measures or presence, Russia would basically be allowed to get a foothold into Ukraine through the Donbass, lick its wounds and replenish its military supplies for a year or two, and then repeat the invasion. Only this time, Ukraine would be even worse off than it is now if NATO doesn't provide vital military support. But amidst the current breakdown of US-Ukraine relations and Trump withdrawing support, there's the economic effect on the rest of NATO. BBC and Kiel Institute figures differ slightly, but both agree that the US contributed a significant portion of the total economic and military relief to the organization. For general economic assistance, the US contribution constituted between 33% and 49% of all aid to Ukraine. If Trump makes good on his announcement, questionable because we've seen him say one thing and do another multiple times, the rest of NATO would effectively have to increase their donations by between 50% and 100% to make up for the loss. For most NATO countries, this means piling on more debt or reducing some of its state budgets to send vital financial relief. As for military support, the US hit unprecedented levels of donations that Europe would be hard-pressed to match. For example, the US sent over 4.5 million rounds of ammunition and artillery rounds to Ukraine in 2024, while Europe failed to send even 1 million. New designs and industrial capacities from Germany have led to some NATO leaders suggesting a new benchmark of 2 million rounds per year. But two problems followed this proclamation. One, the new goal might not be met in the same vein as the previous one. Two, the increased production is still below US capacities and likely much less than Ukraine actually needs to maintain defensive positions and repel Russia. Similarly, the US has contributed roughly the same number of military vehicles, specifically HIMARS rocket launchers and modern tanks, as the rest of Europe combined. The US currently has one of the world's largest arsenals of armored vehicles and artillery, the latter being Russia's forte. So NATO also needs to ramp up its own domestic production if it doesn't want to send vehicles that are part of their active forces. Finally, and perhaps most concerningly, the US is currently the only country in the world that actually deters Russia from launching nuclear weapons. The two nations have comparable nuclear arsenal sizes and capabilities speculated to be around 3,500 weapons, and around 1,700 of those are currently deployed. The US has a significant logistical advantage due to having distributed nuclear weapons and launch options through its military bases in Europe on nuclear submarines, as well as weapons in the mainland and Alaska. By comparison, the UK and France have only around 225 nuclear weapons, and both countries primarily have submarine-launched missiles rather than intercontinental ballistic missiles or aircraft-deployed versions. The current UK and France deterrence lies in their second strike capability, where the submarines could launch a full-scale nuclear strike even if the entire European mainland is destroyed. France had recently proposed extending its independent nuclear deterrence shield to the rest of Europe, which uncoincidentally happened at the same time as Trump's 180-degree turn away from NATO and toward Russia. Ultimately, however, it's China who might reap the most benefits from the current breakdown in Western relations. China has peddled a position of neutrality, which was in fact a thinly veiled alliance with Russia on practically every count. While China had openly supported Ukraine's territorial integrity ratified in the 1994 agreement and suggested that Crimea technically belongs to Ukraine, it hadn't condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, nor the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Instead, China actively helped Russia bypass the economic sanctions imposed by the West in 2022. When Western Europe cut off most of the Russian gas and oil imports in 2022, China and India picked up the slack, obtaining Russian resources at a fraction of the original price and helping Russia grow its wartime economy to the point where it was one of the few countries that saw economic growth just a year after the COVID pandemic swept through the world. China's current political claims are undermined by its lack of action. China has made several different proposals for maintaining peace in Eastern Europe or approaching ceasefire talks, but none of them went further than outlining broad ideas, rather than suggesting concrete plans and directions. It's also dispatched its special representative for Eurasian affairs to Europe to bolster diplomacy between China, Ukraine, and NATO. This attempt failed, as the representative Li Wei, who served as China's ambassador to Moscow for a decade and was widely perceived to be pro-Russian, came to Europe merely echoing Russia's demands rather than providing China's own perspective or fresh ideas. Similarly, China has shunned most attempts at diplomacy with Ukraine. Putin and Xi Jinping met on 4 separate occasions since the war started. In contrast, Zelensky has had only one video call with Xi in 2023. Ukraine's Minister of Foreign Affairs met with China's foreign minister away from the capital, while Russia's minister was granted a direct audience with Xi at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing. China has also clearly shown double standards in international relations with the allies of Ukraine and Russia. It had previously spoken against NATO sending its own troops to Ukraine, as it would fuel the conflict, yet turn a blind eye when North Korea dispatched over 10,000 of its own men to Kursk in 2024. Through all of that, China had banned vital mineral and metal exports to the US in late 2024, just weeks after Putin won the election. The resources in question, germanium, antimony, and gallium, are all used in producing semiconductors, fiber optic cables, and LEDs, as well as various optics equipment for military use such as night vision and thermal imaging. In a similar vein, China has been importing vast quantities of Russian resources such as oil, gas, timber, and various metals, but it also previously staked some claims to its fresh water supply, such as Lake Baikal. It's not out of the realm of possibility that should Russia win the war and occupy the territory, some of Ukraine's resources would go straight to China to fuel its industry. So what can be done? Europe needs to decide how to proceed in a new world order where the decades-long alliance with the US means practically nothing for global security now. Ukraine needs to approach a more Eurocentric narrative that puts its security above all else, possibly conceding its resources to Europe rather than the US or Russia in return for receiving European peacekeeping forces. And European leaders need to rethink China's supposed neutrality and mediator roles and think inward to create a more unified policy toward external diplomacy. But what do you think? Let us know in the comments below, and thank you for watching.